Hey everyone. Tonight we're diving into Asia's university libraries, places meant for knowledge, but after dark they tell very different stories. Students whisper about tutors who don't exist, study groups with members that cast no reflection, and books that seem to write themselves. What happens when the drive to succeed is so strong it follows you beyond death? Let's find out. Our story begins with Amy, a third-year medical student at a prestigious Hong Kong university known for producing some of Asia's finest doctors. 22 years old, methodical in her approach to everything from morning coffee to complex surgical procedures, Amy had developed a reputation among her classmates for her unwavering dedication to her studies. Her routine was precise. Classes until 6 p.m., dinner at the campus cafeteria, then straight to the medical library by 8 p.m. Amy had claimed the same corner desk on the 7th floor for over 2 years. Table 47C, positioned perfectly between the pathology and anatomy sections where she could access the specialized textbooks her coursework demanded. The medical library after hours was a different world from its daytime bustle. During regular hours, the space buzzed with stressed students, group discussions, and the constant shuffle of textbooks being moved between shelves. But after 10 p.m., when the undergraduate students retreated to their dormitories, the library transformed into something more cathedral-like, hushed, reverent, populated only by the most dedicated graduate students and medical residents. Amy thrived in this environment. She would arrive with her medical bag converted into a study kit, highlighters arranged by color, notebooks labeled by subject, and a thermos of jasmine tea that would last her through the early morning hours. Her study materials spread across the large desk in perfect organization. Anatomy atlases to the left, pathology textbooks center, pharmacology references to the right. The security guard, an elderly man named Mr. Leung, had grown accustomed to Amy's presence during his nightly rounds. She was always there at midnight when he checked the 7th floor, always at the same desk, always surrounded by the same carefully arranged materials. He appreciated students like Amy, serious, respectful, never leaving messes for the cleaning staff to handle. Amy's dedication wasn't just academic, it was personal. Her family had immigrated to Hong Kong when she was 12, and becoming a doctor represented everything they had sacrificed for. Every late night in the library was a step closer to honoring their faith in her abilities. Every exam passed a validation of their decision to leave everything behind for her education. The 7th floor became her second home during exam periods. She knew every creak the building made as it settled, every pattern of light and shadow cast by the street lamps outside, every sound that belonged to the normal rhythm of the library after dark. During her second week of intensive studying for pathology finals, Amy began noticing something that didn't fit the familiar pattern of nighttime library sounds. Around 1:30 a.m., when the building reached its deepest quiet, she would hear pages turning in the anatomy section. Not the quick flipping of someone searching for specific information, but slow, deliberate page turning, as if someone were reading carefully, absorbing every word. The sound was distinct from the building's normal settling noises. Amy had spent enough nights in the library to distinguish between the creak of old wood, the whisper of air through ventilation systems, and the actual sound of paper being turned by human hands. This was definitely the latter, but it occurred in a section that should have been empty. When the sounds began, Amy would look up from her studies, pen poised over her notes, listening carefully. The page turning would continue for exactly 15 minutes, then stop abruptly, as if whoever was reading had reached a natural breakpoint. During her first few encounters with the phenomenon, Amy assumed it was another dedicated student, perhaps someone who preferred the anatomy section's different lighting or seating arrangement. But when she investigated, walking quietly through the stacks to see who else was burning the midnight oil, she found the anatomy section completely empty. All the chairs were pushed under their tables, all the books properly shelved. No sign that anyone had been reading in the area. Yet as soon as she returned to her own desk, the page turning would resume. Amy began timing the phenomenon. It started at 1:30 a.m. with mathematical precision, lasted exactly 15 minutes, then silence until 2:15 a.m. when it would begin again. The pattern repeated 3 times each night, always stopping completely by 3:30 a.m. The consistency was remarkable, too regular to be random building noises, too purposeful to be anything other than deliberate action. She mentioned it casually to other late-night library regulars, but none reported hearing similar sounds. The few students who stayed past midnight typically used the main reading room on the ground floor, leaving the specialized sections like anatomy and pathology largely deserted during the deep night hours. Amy tried to focus on her studies during the page-turning episodes, but found herself increasingly distracted by the mystery. Who was reading so methodically at such a precise schedule? And why did they seem to vanish whenever she tried to locate them? The following night, Amy came prepared with a small thermometer, a digital device she'd borrowed from the chemistry lab. She wanted to document whether her growing sense of unease was affecting her perception of the library's temperature, or if something genuinely unusual was occurring in her study area. At exactly 1:30 a.m., the familiar page turning began in the anatomy section. But tonight, something additional happened. Amy watched the thermometer's display drop from a comfortable 22 degrees Celsius to 16 degrees Celsius within the span of 2 minutes. Her breath became visible in small puffs as she worked, and she found herself pulling her jacket tighter around her shoulders. The temperature drop was localized around her desk in the adjacent anatomy section. When she walked to other parts of the 7th floor, the thermometer returned to normal readings. But in her corner study area, the air remained unnaturally cold throughout the 15-minute episode of page turning. More disturbing was what she found when she investigated the anatomy section during the temperature drop. One of the heavy medical textbooks, Gray's Anatomy, a comprehensive text she recognized from her first-year studies, lay open on one of the reading tables. The book was open to chapter 23, The Nervous System in Death, a section dealing with post-mortem neurological changes. Amy was certain the book hadn't been there when she'd arrived at the library that evening. All textbooks had been properly shelved, and she had made her usual survey of the area before settling into her study routine. Yet here was this massive textbook, open to a highly specific section, positioned as if someone had been reading it moments before. When she approached the open book, the cold intensified dramatically. The pages felt ice cold to the touch, and frost had begun forming along the edges of the paper despite the library's warm, humid air. Her fingers left brief impressions on the frost-covered pages, evidence of the impossible temperature difference between the book and its environment. Most unsettling of all, when Amy tried to close the book and return it to its shelf, it fell open again to the exact same chapter. 3 times she closed it, 3 times it opened to the nervous system in death, as if the book itself insisted on remaining open to that particular section. The page-turning sounds continued throughout this investigation, but now they seemed to be coming from the book itself, even though Amy could see that its pages weren't moving. She stood in the cold air, watching frost form on a medical textbook, while invisible hands seemed to turn pages that remained perfectly still. On the third night, Amy decided to bring a small mirror, ostensibly for checking her appearance during long study sessions, but actually to observe the anatomy section indirectly while appearing to focus on her work. What she discovered challenged her understanding of reality itself. At 1:30 a.m., as the familiar page turning began, Amy angled her mirror to reflect the anatomy reading area while pretending to study her pathology notes. In the mirror's reflection, she could clearly see a figure hunched over the same table where she had found the frost-covered textbook the previous night. The figure appeared to be a young man, thin to the point of gauntness, wearing what looked like an outdated student uniform, the kind of formal wear that Hong Kong universities had required decades earlier. His movements were methodical and precise as he turned pages in the large textbook, taking notes in careful handwriting. But when Amy looked directly at the anatomy section, without the mirror's mediation, she saw only empty tables and properly shelved books. The figure existed only in reflection, visible only when observed indirectly, as if he occupied a space slightly removed from normal reality. As Amy watched through her mirror, the figure seemed to become aware of her observation. He looked up from his textbook and appeared to stare directly at her reflection, though his gaze felt like it was penetrating through the mirror to make actual eye contact with her. His face was pale and drawn, with dark circles under his eyes that suggested countless nights of intensive studying. More disturbing was what happened to her own study materials during these episodes. While she watched the reflected figure, her own textbooks began moving slightly on her desk. Pages would flip open to chapters she hadn't been reading, always settling on topics related to death, disease, and pathological processes. Her highlighters would roll across the desk surface as if moved by unfelt breezes, and her notebooks would flip open to blank pages that somehow felt expectant, as if waiting for notes she wasn't taking. The figure in the mirror appeared to be copying text from his medical books, but Amy noticed that he would occasionally look up at her and write something in the margins of his notebooks. His handwriting was too small and too distant for her to read through the mirror, but the repeated glances in her direction suggested that she had become part of his study session. When the page turning stopped at its usual 1:45 a.m. mark, the figure would close his books, gather his materials with the same methodical precision Amy used for her own study routine, and walk toward what appeared to be the stairwell. But he never actually departed. When Amy checked the real anatomy section moments later, it remained empty, with no sign that anyone had been studying there. Amy's academic training had taught her to document observations carefully and objectively. As a future doctor, she needed to separate emotional reactions from factual evidence. So on the fourth night, she brought her smartphone and set it to record video during the 1:30 a.m. episode, positioning it to capture both her study area and the anatomy section simultaneously. What she found when she reviewed the footage later that night shook her to her core. The video clearly showed a second figure in the library, the same gaunt young man she had observed in her mirror, but now visible directly in the recorded footage. He sat at the table in the anatomy section, surrounded by medical textbooks, writing steadily in what appeared to be a notebook. His clothing was indeed outdated, suggesting someone from an earlier era of the university's history. But most chilling was what the video revealed about his activities. Using her phone's zoom function, Amy could see that the figure wasn't taking normal study notes. Instead, he was writing her name repeatedly in the margins of his notebook. Amy Chen, Amy Chen, Amy Chen, in careful handwriting that suggested obsessive repetition. Between the repeated names, he had written detailed observations about her study habits, arrives at 8 p.m. precisely, prefers pathology to anatomy, drinks jasmine tea, sits at table 47-C, stays until 3 a.m. on weeknights. The notes were so detailed and personal that they read like a surveillance report rather than academic study materials. Most disturbing of all, the figure periodically looked directly at the camera, not at Amy herself, but at the phone's camera lens, as if he were aware of being recorded and wanted to make sure his image was captured clearly. His gaze into the camera felt deliberate, communicative, as if he were trying to send Amy a message through the recorded footage. The video also revealed something Amy hadn't noticed during the actual experience. Her own study materials were being annotated by invisible hands. While she worked on pathology diagrams, her textbook showed additional notes appearing in the margins, corrections to her work, supplementary information, and references to advanced concepts she hadn't yet studied. The handwriting in her books matched the handwriting in the figure's notebook perfectly. When Amy tried to cross-reference this handwriting with her own notes and previous study materials, she found no matches. This wasn't her handwriting, or that of any study partner she had worked with. Yet somehow, this unknown person was improving her work, correcting her errors, and adding information that invariably turned out to be accurate when she checked it against advanced medical references. The next morning, Amy approached Mrs. Liu, the head librarian who had worked at the university for over 30 years. Mrs. Liu was known for her encyclopedic knowledge of the library's history and her genuine care for students who treated the space with respect. Mrs. Liu, Amy began carefully, I've been having some unusual experiences while studying in the medical library late at night. I was wondering if you knew anything about the history of the 7th floor, particularly the anatomy section. Mrs. Liu's expression changed immediately. Her usual warm smile faded, replaced by a look of concern that seemed to age her face by years. What kind of experiences? She asked quietly, glancing around to ensure they wouldn't be overheard by other students. Amy described her encounters without mentioning the supernatural aspects, the sounds of page turning, the temperature drops, the sense of not being alone during her late-night study sessions. She was careful to present her experiences as objectively as possible, focusing on observable phenomena rather than her interpretations. Mrs. Liu listened without interruption, her expression growing increasingly troubled with each detail Amy shared. When Amy finished her account, the librarian was quiet for a long moment, clearly debating how much to reveal. There's something you should know about that section of the library, Mrs. Liu finally said. 15 years ago, during the spring exam period, we had a tragedy. A medical student named Chen Wei was found dead at one of the anatomy section tables. He had been studying for his pathology finals. Amy felt ice forming in her stomach. How did he die? Suicide, Mrs. Liu said quietly. The pressure of medical school, combined with some personal issues, became too much for him. He had been spending every night in the library for weeks before it happened, always at the same table, always studying the same subjects. Other students had expressed concern about his behavior. He had become obsessed with death and disease, spending all his time reading about pathological processes. Mrs. Liu pulled out a folder of old library records, the kind of documentation that institutions keep but rarely discuss. Chen Wei was found on a Tuesday morning by the cleaning staff. He had been dead for several hours, sitting at his usual study spot surrounded by medical textbooks. His notebook was filled with detailed notes about death and decay, written in the most careful handwriting I've ever seen. "Which table?" Amy asked, though she dreaded the answer. "Table 23-A in the anatomy section. It's directly across from table 47-C, your usual study spot." Amy realized that the figure she had been observing, both in her mirror and in the video footage, had been sitting at the exact location where Chen Wei had died 15 years earlier. "Mrs. Liu, have other students reported similar experiences?" The librarian nodded reluctantly. "Every few years during exam periods, we get reports from students studying late in that section. Strange sounds, cold spots, the feeling of being watched. Most students just change their study location, but a few have described encounters very similar to what you've told me. What happens to those students?" Mrs. Liu's expression grew even more concerned. "Their grades typically improve dramatically. They become exceptional students almost overnight, but they also become obsessed. They spend more and more time in the library, less time with friends and family. Some have had to withdraw from the university due to health issues related to overwork and social isolation." Despite Mrs. Liu's warnings, Amy found herself unable to stay away from her corner desk on the 7th floor. She told herself it was because exam period was approaching and she needed the familiar environment to study effectively. But the truth was more complex. She had become addicted to the supernatural tutoring she was receiving. The annotations appearing in her textbooks were incredibly helpful. Chen Wei, or whatever remained of him, possessed a depth of medical knowledge that surpassed her professors. His corrections to her work were always accurate. His supplementary notes invariably led her to better understanding of complex concepts, and his study suggestions consistently aligned with exam content. Amy's grades began improving dramatically. Her pathology exam scores jumped from B+ to A+. Her anatomy practical assessments became flawless, and her clinical reasoning showed sophistication that impressed her professors. She was becoming the medical student she had always dreamed of being, but the transformation came with costs she hadn't anticipated. Her friends began expressing concern about her appearance and behavior. She had grown pale and thin, spending every available hour in the library rather than eating regular meals or getting adequate sleep. Dark circles under her eyes made her look increasingly like the figure she encountered each night. Gaunt, obsessed, consumed by academic pursuit. More troubling was how she had begun talking to herself during study sessions. Other students reported seeing her having animated conversations with empty chairs, responding to questions no one else could hear, taking dictation as if someone were lecturing her privately. Amy's study schedule had expanded beyond even her previous intensive routine. She now arrived at the library by 6 p.m. and stayed until the security guards forced her to leave at 6 a.m. when the cleaning staff arrived. She had stopped attending social events, rarely returned phone calls, and had begun declining invitations to study groups with living classmates. The corner desk on the 7th floor had become her entire world. Her textbooks were now covered with annotations in 2 distinct handwritings: her own, increasingly frantic notes, and Chen Wei's careful, methodical corrections. The margins of her medical books looked like dual conversations, question and answer sessions between a desperate student and a patient tutor who never grew tired of explaining complex concepts. Amy's family began receiving concerning reports from her professors. While her academic performance had become exemplary, her social integration had deteriorated completely. She attended classes but sat alone, participated in discussions but seemed to be responding to prompts others couldn't hear, and submitted assignments that were technically perfect but felt disconnected from collaborative learning environments. The final sign that something had gone seriously wrong came when Amy stopped leaving the library altogether. Security guards found her sleeping at her desk, having arranged blankets and personal belongings as if she had moved into the space permanently. When they tried to escort her out, She became agitated, insisting that she couldn't leave because someone was waiting for her, someone who had been helping her become a better student.